Do you think that the Biden Justice Department is going to stop him from becoming president again?
I think that the Justice Department is going to follow the facts and the evidence. I think that they clearly seen significant activity in terms of the individuals that they now have testifying in front of the grand jury in D.C. And I think they're taking their obligation seriously. I think we've certainly seen in our hearings when you have the former Attorney General, former White House counsel, former acting Attorney General, former Deputy Attorney General, when you have individuals who served Donald Trump, who were nominated by him and who served at the highest levels, who have testified in front of the committee and made clear, for example, as did Pat Cipollone, that President Trump didn't want people to leave the Capitol. Now, Mr. Cipollone made that point trying to protect executive privilege, but I don't think anybody had any doubt what he was saying. And so I think the Justice Department is, from what I can tell from the outside, committed to following the facts and following the evidence, and they're taking it seriously.
Some have expressed concern that prosecuting former President Trump would turn him into a martyr and potentially add to his political strength with a base that follows him pretty rapidly. Do you share that concern? Do you have any concern that a prosecution would strengthen Donald Trump's political hand?
I don't think that it's appropriate to think about it that way, because the question for us is, are we a nation of laws? Are we a country where no one is above the law? And what do the facts and the evidence show? And certainly, I've been very clear. I think he's guilty of the most serious dereliction of duty of any president in our nation's history. You've had a federal judge in California say that it's more likely than not that he and John Eastman committed two crimes. So, I think that we're going to continue to follow the facts. I think the Department of Justice will do that, but they have to make decisions about prosecution, understanding what it means if the facts and the evidence are there and they decide not to prosecute. How do we then call ourselves a nation of laws? I think that's a very serious balancing.
It sounds like you think that the evidence is there and that if they don't follow that evidence, that's a dereliction of duty on their part.
Well, the committee has been, I think, very thorough in laying out much of what we know. There's much more that we have not yet shared in hearings and that we anticipate we will share in the fall. But, and we will also make decisions about criminal referrals. And ultimately, the decision about prosecution is up to the Justice Department, but I would anticipate that the committee will have an opinion on that.
CNN is reporting that the Pentagon texts from January 6th are missing. This is, of course, after the Department of Homeland Security and the Secret Service seem to have lost texts. Do you think there was malicious intent behind the Pentagon's deletion of texts related to that day?
I don't know that's the case. I haven't seen evidence of malicious intent. I do think, though, that it's concerning that you have text messages apparently, and this is based on the news reporting, but text messages apparently of some of the senior officials, people like Kash Patel, apparently not available. Now, certainly as a committee, we'll get to the bottom of that. We've been working with the Secret Service in a situation has been reported where text messages are not available or were erased off of phones. But we've received hundreds of thousands of documents from the Secret Service and significant information from them that the committee is going through and will use in our investigation and as we conduct interviews of additional Secret Service agents.
How much would you say you have learned that was unexpected? I mean, you obviously have a lot more information than the general public does in your head about what happened that day. But when you started these hearings earlier this year, did you have any idea how much you would know by this point?
It's been more information and a more sophisticated and broader reaching effort than I understood coming into it. I think all of us on the committee have had that same reaction, which is that there was so much more that was happening in multiple different areas, whether it was the pressure on state officials or the pressure on the Justice Department, or the attempt to corruptly pressure the vice president himself. So I think that the volume of information has been more than I expected, and certainly I obviously came into this very concerned, and the information itself has not lessened my concern at all.
Are you in contact with the former Vice President, Mike Pence, as you're learning this new information?
No, we've had discussions with his counsel, obviously, about his interactions with the committee, but not with him personally.
What's your assessment of how he's handling potentially running for president? Because he's out there kind of opposing the former president, but unlike you, he's not out there criticizing former President Trump.
What I would say is that Vice President Pence was a hero on January 6th, and that it's very clear that there was tremendous pressure from a number of different places on him, and he did his duty, and he didn't succumb to that pressure. And if he had succumbed to that pressure, things would have been very different. And so I think that we owe him gratitude for how he conducted himself, and for his refusal to do what Donald Trump wanted him to do, which would have been illegal and unconstitutional.
Do you think he'd be an ally in the fight to keep Trump out of the Oval Office?
Let me just leave it where I did. I think that his actions on January 6th are ones for which the nation should be grateful.
There's been a lot of speculation about how the committee is or isn't making an impact with the American people, especially when it comes to this question of whether Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee and eventually potentially president of the United States again. Do you think the committee's work is moving the needle politically?
I don't think about it that way. I think about it more because I think it's important that the committee's work not be viewed through a political lens, and that's not how I think about that. I think about it in terms of whether or not we're reaching people who understand how serious the threat was and continues to be. And I think in that regard, we have done a job that I'm proud of.
Do you think there are enough people out there in the country who share these concerns that you have, and that many people who were also at the Capitol on that day have? Are there enough Americans out there to move the needle?
I think that the vast majority of Americans understand how important it is that we have peaceful transitions of power, and that at the heart of who we are as Americans, and at the heart of our republic, is a peaceful transition of power. And no matter what your party affiliation is, you have to have a president who will guarantee that. And Donald Trump did not. And so I do think that as more and more facts become known, people are paying attention and understanding how serious the threat is.